Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to our 21st webinar series at CIGA. This is a very special day for us because it marks the 72nd anniversary of the Nakba, and as appropriate for today, we have invited the illustrious Dr. Ilan Pape to be our guest. Dr. Pape has been a leading historian on ethnic cleansing in Palestine. He has written a number of books. Currently, he's at the University of Exeter, where he directs a program where he is a professor of history. He has written on Palestine, such as the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 2006, and most recently he has finished a work on 10 myths of Israel. Today he will be speaking about the relationship, the future of Palestine in light of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu's plan for Israel. I would like to invite Dr. Pape to begin his presentation. Just a quick reminder before he begins, we'll have about 45 to 50 minutes of his talk, followed up by questions, which I will funnel through online participants and myself. With that brief introduction, Dr. Pape, the floor is yours. You'll have to unmute your mic.
Yeah, I'm muting. Yes, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be on the Ramadan series of CIGA, and it's a great honor to be talking on the eve of the Nakba Day, which is actually tomorrow, May the 15th. I will address three issues, or my talk will have three parts as I want to discuss the Trump-Netanyahu so-called deal of the century and its implication for the future. First of all, I would like to say something historically about American policy before the Trump administration came into power. Secondly, I would like to see what are the motives behind the Netanyahu-Trump deal of the century, or rather steal of the century. And finally, say something about the possible implication of this deal for the future, and try to assess possible trends and developments as a result of this initiative. In many ways, the American policy towards the question of Palestine has not changed much with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. American policy towards the Palestine question until 2016 was based on an unconditional support for the Israeli position, while occasionally using tougher language to condemn Israel for certain actions, or declaring that, at least from the international point of view, certain Israeli policies, such as the Jewish settlements within the West Bank, are not accepted by the United States. But all in all, the American administrations up to Trump did not walk the walk, while they might have talked the talk, as the American says. And this is the main difference between the previous administrations and the Trump administration. The gap between what is declared as a policy and what is the policy on the ground has been reduced dramatically under Trump. And this is may be important for people who still believe that the Palestinian struggle can be based on some support from liberals in America who would not like to see the United States violate brutally international law, or would not like to see the United States as supporting all the extreme policies of Israel. But in the end of the day, even such soft criticism and such hopes proved to be insignificant, as what really mattered is that if we look historically at American policy from 1967 until today, Pax Americana meant a totally free hand for whatever Israeli government was in power to implement a policy which meant the continued ethnic cleansing of Palestine that started in 1948. Namely, Israel was pushing for a policy that allowed it to annex more and more territories in the occupied West Bank, and to kick out and ethnically cleanse through Judaization those territories within the West Bank that successive Israeli governments deemed important for the survival of the State of Israel. Yes, there was one change in Israeli policy, we are all aware of it, in 2006 regarding the Gaza Strip. Ariel Sharon, then the Prime Minister, actually before that, decided to take out the Jewish settlers, the few thousand settlers who were within the Gaza Strip, and this triggered a different development in the Strip with the rise of the Hamas to power and its struggle against the Israeli occupation that led to the siege and the blockade. But if we look at it in a wider kind of view, both the Israeli policy towards the Gaza Strip and the policy towards the West Bank, and indeed the policy towards the Palestinians inside Israel and the refugees, in other words, Israeli policy towards the Palestinians wherever they are, is the same policy. The means might be different from implementing it. So there's a different policy towards the Gaza Strip because of the Hamas resistance. There's a different policy towards the West Bank because of a certain collaboration of the PA, and a different policy towards the Palestinians inside Israel. But they are all motivated by the same strategy that led a lot of scholars to define Zionism as a settler colonial movement that wishes to have as much of the homeland of the indigenous people with as few of them as possible in it. Israel executed a huge ethnic cleansing operation in 1948 to implement this settler colonialist strategy. It was not possible to do the same after 67 for various reasons, but it found other means of incrementally taking over the territory that was still not under its control, and incrementally downsizing the number of the native Palestinians in it. And since there is an incompletion still, mainly because of the Palestinian struggle, this is a project that Israel is still involved in. And that brings us to the steal of the century, or the deal of the century. The American deal of the century, Trump's deal of the century, should be seen together with other American initiatives since Trump became president. One is the transferring the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, recognizing the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, recognizing the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and diverting from a traditional American policy that saw the Jewish settlements in the West Bank as illegal. And altogether, all these initiatives came into one big initiative when the early bits of the piece of the deal of the century were publicized in Bahrain when Jared Kushner went there to elicit the support of Arab leaders to the new American strategy. And the idea behind that strategy was that is the wish, or the motive behind this strategy, is the wish to depoliticize the Palestinian question, to turn it into an issue of humanitarian project and mostly an economic project. In other words, if there are any issues still remaining in what used to be historical Palestine, these are mainly economic and humanitarian issues, and they should be solved by financial aid and funding. And therefore, Kushner went, and the president went to what they deemed as rich Arab countries to chip in and help with this. But depoliticizing also means that in such a way you claim that there is no political issue here, and therefore the Palestinians do not have any political rights, not the right of self-determination, not the right of independence, neither the right of return or any other political rights that a nation like Palestine has under international law are being wiped out by, or are being intended to be wiped out by this idea of the deal of the century. This fitted very well with the strategy that leading politicians and generals and strategists in Israel have been working on in the last 20 years, since the beginning of this century. And this is a strategy that is accepted by almost everyone within the Jewish political map in Israel, or one could call within the Zionist political system inside the state of Israel. Namely, any party and any individual who define themselves as Zionist subscribe to this strategy that developed since the beginning of the century, which is also a continuation of older Zionist plans and programs going back as far as possible to the very beginning of the Zionist project in Palestine in the late 19th century. Now, this strategy is the following. It's a strategy based on the idea of unilateralism. Israel does not have to negotiate anything with anyone with regard to the way it wants to finalize or bring to an end what it would call its Palestinian problem. And this unilateralism is based on the idea that time is on your side. You don't have to rush with huge projects as had been done in 1948, but you have to be constantly on the move and use the law, the army, power, and other means to implement this unilateral strategy. The unilateral strategy is meant to annex to Israel officially and in some cases informally the areas that Israel has occupied during the June 67 war. In many ways, this is done by a new idea of partition in the West Bank, partitioning between areas that are deemed to be under or deemed to be in the future integral part of the state of Israel, and areas which can be ruled from the outside indirectly with the collaboration of local bodies, as Israel is now doing with the PA with regard to areas A and B in the West Bank. Where they have a problem, as they do in the Gaza Strip because of the position of the Hamas, as we can see, different means are used there, the siege, the blockade, but from an Israeli point of view, this is also a way of controlling the area from the outside. So this is indirect rule, not direct rule, but definitely they regard it as part of their rules. They also use the situation in the south to train their army. They believe that this is also important for an army to be involved in semi-military or fully military confrontation, as most of the Arab countries, if not all of them, have given up the idea of a conventional war with Israel, apart from Hezbollah, which is not a state, but is still there exercising its resistance in various forms against Israel. So this unilateralism is exercised on a daily basis in the West Bank. It could be an expropriation of land, expulsion of people, using the settlers as agents of provocation to pressure people to leave areas which Israel wants to annex. This happened in the Jordan Valley, in the area which is called Masafir Yatta, south of Mount Hebron. A combination of military harassment and settler harassment has led few communities to disintegrate and to leave, although the younger generation there is showing some more steadfastness and tries to stay on under really very harsh conditions. Occasionally the international community is interested in what goes on there, and then there is a certain ease in these actions, but on a daily basis, the ethnic cleansing of large parts of the West Bank is part of this unilateral actions on the ground. A different kind of policy is taking place in Jerusalem. I would say it's similar to the policies of Israel in those parts of the West Bank that I've mentioned, but in a much more accelerated and a much more intensive way. The attempt to Judaize East Jerusalem and by moving hundreds and thousands of Jewish settlers and by forcing Palestinians out of what Israel calls the municipal area of Greater Jerusalem, which is like an amoeba growing day by day, and it's almost now 1/3 of the West Bank. Towards the Palestinians and Israel, there's a different kind of interpretation of this unilateral action of taking as much of the land with as few people on it as possible, and this was articulated very well in the Israeli nationality law in 2018, in the end of 2018, which declared that more or less between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean there will be only one national group, the Jewish national group, demoted the Palestinian citizens in Israel to people who speak the Arabic language but are not recognized in any way as a collective with its own rights. And of course there are other laws that accompany this law which diminishes their rights as individual citizens as well. But here is the nationality law shows you exactly how the actions of the ground on the ground, which I described, and the motivation for the Trump deal of the century are fitting together with the Netanyahu government's perspective on how to implement this unilateralism. By pushing forward the nationality law, Israel moved to legalize the idea that the state of Israel extends actually over all of historical Palestine. And secondly, that within historical Palestine, the Israelis and by association the Americans through the deal of the century do not recognize anyone else as a national group within these borders. This is another way of depoliticizing the Palestine question by claiming that there is only one homeland and only one national movement and therefore only one national nation state, the Jewish state of Israel. In many ways, this is legalizing an apartheid system through a fundamental law in the Israeli Knesset and through the blessing of a new American administration. The last thing that both Israel and the Americans did, and this was particularly done by the Israelis in order to cement this depolitization of the Palestine question, is closing all the archives in Israel that have in them documents that pertain to the Nakba. Namely, any archives that have in them documentation of the Israeli policies and actions during the Nakba that had been declassified before and have been open to the public are now closed, and God knows, maybe these documents are destroyed. And again, the idea, in fact, the people who are responsible for this closure said it very clearly in interviews they gave to the Israeli press. The idea is, and it's a stupid idea, but it's an interesting logic that they are putting forward, is that if I won't be able, as an historian who already wrote about 1948 and about the ethnic cleansing, if I won't be able to reproduce as the original documentation from the Israeli archives, people would suspect that my narrative is not academically sound. And secondly, future generation of scholars will not be able to revisit documentation in order to prove, for instance, my argument and other people's argument that Israel committed a crime against humanity by expelling half of Palestine's population, demolishing half of Palestine's villages, and destroying most of the Palestinian towns within 9 months in the year of 1948. Of course, the closure of the documents and the archive is not going to undermine the truth about what happened in 1948, but I'm bringing it not because I think it's a valid argument, but as another manifestation of this idea that you can use nowadays power in Washington and in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in order to depoliticize the question by wiping the history through destruction of documents or by closure of documents, and by claiming through law and through a White House policy paper that there isn't such a thing as a Palestinian national movement and there isn't such a thing as Palestinian political rights. This is the strategy. In many ways, it is an assault on the Palestinian people, which is as lethal and as brutal as the assault on the Palestinian people in 1948. Of course, it has a different form, but when it is seen in conjunction with the actions on the ground, especially the actions that Israel has been taking under the cloud of the virus crisis, the coronavirus crisis. If you take, and I would say something about these actions, if taken together, this legislation, this American position, this attitude towards scholarship, together with the actions on the ground, shows you that this assault is a physical assault on people and also a cultural assault or a cultural side, an attempt to destroy a culture, a nation, its history, its narrative, and also its very existence on the ground. I just want to mention very shortly that, and I'm sure many of our viewers today are aware of it if you follow the news, that under the guise of the corona crisis and believing that the world is focused on this virus to such an extent that it would not be interested in what goes on the ground in Palestine, Israel has moved again to intensive imprisonment of children, which it stopped for a while under international condemnation, expropriation of land, arrests without a trial, and kicking out, expelling people from their territories, from their homes and villages. But this is not just the usual harassment that Palestinians in those areas have suffered since 1967. This is also kind of an auxiliary policy to help push towards a more significant takeover of Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, and annexing it to Israel, de-Arabizing it, and making life for anyone who would dare to define themselves as Palestinians, either inside Israel or elsewhere, very difficult and very dangerous. Now, let me talk about the possible future implication of this policy. Now, it's very clear, I think, to anyone who understands the history of Palestine and the history of the Palestinian national movement that the attempt to depoliticize Palestine will not succeed. Palestinian refugees know that they are victims of ethnic cleansing, regardless of whether they have access or don't have access to the Israeli archives. Their children and their grandchildren know it also very well. A national movement or a liberation movement is not being delegitimized by legislation by the colonizer. We know it from history. And therefore, the Palestine issue would not be depoliticized. However, on the ground, the more brutal actions that are meant to depoliticize, that include an incremental ethnic cleansing and takeover, are not likely to be stopped, because there is no, at this present juncture, there is no coalition of forces that can prevent Israel from implement its policies on the ground. And of course, the fact that it has a friendly administration in Washington that gives it green light for all these actions make it even more difficult to stop this brutal policy. But the interesting thing is to look more focusedly in order to try and assess, and I'm not a prophet and never pretended to be one, and therefore I'm very careful when I talk about the future. I'm just talking about present trends that might be important for the future. The major focus should be on the gap that exists in societies all over the world, especially since 2008, not only on the question of Palestine, also on other very important moral issues. The gap between policies of political elites on the one hand and the attitudes of the civil society in those countries on the other. Palestine is one of the issues where the gap between the official policies of governments and political elites and the attitudes of civil society, the gap is widening dramatically and drastically in recent years. This is true not just about Europe, where I think many of you know that this reality that I describe exists, namely between the official policies of Western governments and the attitudes of whoever is part of the civil society when it comes to the question of Palestine. This is also true about the United States, where, if you'll forgive me, I'll just close the window. Sorry about it, there was a noise from the outside. It's also true about the United States, where the society has undergone a very fundamental change in its attitudes towards the Palestine question. The campuses in America are a good example for the shift towards full support of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. Many churches have underwent such a change, and also trade unions. One of the biggest manifestation, one of the most important manifestation in the States for this shift is the veering towards supporting the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction campaign. This is also true about the Arab world. We saw it during the so-called Arab Spring. One of the major bones of contention between governments and the people who demonstrated for democracy and rights is the government's position on the Palestine question, and that's why so many demonstrators during the Arab Spring donned themselves with a Palestinian flag. I've been recently to Malaysia and to several Muslim countries in Southeast Asia, and although some of these countries have official policies which are much better than many other states in the world, as could have been seen by the Kuala Lumpur meeting of Islamic states in December last year, still the civil society in those countries demands a far more assertive position on Palestine. And this is also true about South America, Africa, and other parts of the world. Namely, what I'm trying to say here is that the deal of the century, the Trump-Netanyahu deal of the century, is not new in the sense that it represents a position, unfortunately, that political elites in the West, some of them in the Arab world, some of them in the Muslim world, and elsewhere in the world, this is a position that was adopted since the creation of the State of Israel. A kind of agreement or consent to towards the Israeli unilateral actions on the ground in order to try and complete what they have not completed during the days of the Nakba. Yes, they expelled half of the population. Yes, they have taken by 67 100% of the Palestinian homeland, but there are still millions of Palestinians inside Palestine, and the Palestinian struggle, even in this moment, which is not the best moment for that movement, is still alive, and the struggle has not ended. And the Israelis have not succeeded in completing what the late scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, used to call the elimination of the native. Mainly due to the Palestinian resistance over the years. Now, looking towards the future, I do not see any immediate change in the points of view of political elites, or if you want, a change in the point of view from above on the Palestine questions. We know that there were very brave attempts by some politicians to divert from their own parties and political groups' policies in Palestine and present a more courageous, independent position in Palestine, and even compete with this platform for a position of power. And I'm thinking mainly here about Jeremy Corbyn in Britain and Bernie Sanders in the United States. But we have seen what happened to them. Even their very soft and very mild support for the Palestinian struggle destroyed them politically. Much more in the case of Corbyn, less so in the case of Sanders. But it's a lesson for younger politicians that if they do dare to go into if they do dare to adopt such bold positions, they will find themselves being accused of anti-Semitism, smeared and intimidated, and they will need to be very courageous and very much at peace with themselves in order to be able to confront a coalition of Christian Zionist, pro-Israeli Jewish lobbies, neoliberals and others who for years provided Israel the umbrella for its impunity on the ground. So this is not going to change very quickly, and therefore the Israeli policies depends on the position of the American administration. I'm afraid to say, even if Biden is going to be the next president, or if it depends on the position of the EU, or Britain, or China, or India, or some of the Arab states, if we look at them, they would allow the Israeli unilateral policies to continue, and we have to take it into account when we planned resistance, when we plan a vision for the future, solidarity, activism, whatever any one of us are involved in the cause we all believe in. However, the question is, in the longer term, will the civil society be able to take such a moral issue as the Palestine issue and use it in order to change policies from above, wherever it happens? I'm very optimistic about it. I think that not only the Palestine issue, many other issues of social injustice are not over yet, and therefore would motivate, especially the younger generation, to seek politics of a different kind. And I think Palestine epitomizes, or a new position in Palestine, epitomizes this new kind of politics. The question of Palestine is important for the younger generations around the world, even those who seem to be focused on other issues, be it ecology, social justice, and other issues. It is important because they do understand it's not the worst atrocity that human beings have committed in the past against other human beings, or even committing today against other human beings. But it's the only one which is not acknowledged. It's the only one which is denied. And this enrages people. And this kind of exceptionalism, this kind of hypocrisy, feeds the activity, the action. But for that to be useful, for that to be a meaningful development for the case, for the cause, and for the sake of the people on the ground who are suffering from the oppressive colonialist policies, in order to make this, if you want, window of opportunity, to open it for us, all of us, in order to change the reality on the ground, there are three things that have to happen. Maybe they're already happening, I don't know, but definitely they're not happening in such a way that they're visible. But three things would have to happen, in my mind, and with this I would end, to confront the evil scheming behind the steal of the century, and be used as a leverage to begin to change the reality on the ground. The first one is very clear to me, and this is a clear, official Palestinian vision for the future. We need to hear from an authentic, democratically elected Palestinian national movement. How does it envision the liberation of Palestine in the 21st century? You cannot go back to texts that were written in the 60s and the 70s. You definitely cannot rely on official Palestinian positions during the so-called peace process, and neither the platform of Palestinian parties inside Israel provide the answer that many of us who work for Palestine need to know. How is the future envisioned? It's very clear that those who pretend, or maybe don't pretend, maybe are considered to be now the representatives of the Palestinian national movement, all support the two-state solution. It's very clear that their electorate has long time ago forsaken this idea and believes that the whole of Palestine has to be liberated. And yet we need to know, what do we envisage for the millions of Jews who live there? What is the message of the Palestinian national movement in the 21st century, not only for the Palestinians, but also to the Jews who live in Israel? This has to come from the Palestinian national movement, and once there is a clear positioning, it will be very easy to work for it and for it by people like myself and others who are part of the solidarity. Because solidarity means that you don't tell people what they should envision, but you learn what their vision is and you're working for it. We don't know what is the Palestinian vision today. So that's one thing. The second thing is, of course, is to continue the solidarity work outside of Palestine, but to break through the walls, the ceilings that did not allow us to enter mainstream academia, mainstream media, and mainstream politics with a clearer narrative of what happened in Palestine, what goes on in Palestine, and what are the principles for a just solution in Palestine. And we don't need to wait for the first thing to happen that I mentioned to happen, as the boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign has proved. Without waiting for the position of the national movement, it was very clear that there is a Palestinian consensus about three basic rights for the Palestinians, either whether they are living inside Israel or in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or in the refugee camps and the exilic communities. The three basic rights, not the right to return, the right not to live under military occupation, and the right to equality within a state, are something that the BDS movement has pushed forward, and many more people than ever before are willing to join that campaign. But this has to be intensified. It has to expand in order that it would reach not only the captive audience, but much more beyond it. And I think what we are witnessing in recent years, which could be one of the answers to the deal of the century, is the, I call it the network of identification, not just the network of identity. We have seen now the Palestinian cause being adopted by indigenous people who fight for the rights in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Latin America. The reference group that sees itself as part of the struggle has expanded, and I'm sure it can be and should be translated into political power. This also includes the African American community in the United States, that many of them, bodies like Black Lives Matter, see the connection between Israel's security policies and the oppressive means the American police is using against African Americans in the United States. So this is the second thing, how to make the shift in public opinion even more effective, so that it reaches the higher echelons of politics, as creating a counter coalition to the coalition that has immunized Israel from any action from the outside, the coalition between Christian Zionists, pro-Zionist Jewish organizations, neoliberals, industrial military complexes. I think we're all familiar with the kind of forces that work against the Palestinians and their rights ever since the Balfour Declaration until today. And the last thing is something that I'm sure we will have to do, but will not be able to push it forward without the two first conditions materializing, is working within the Jewish society in Israel. I don't think that its position is crucial for the success of the project, but I think it is important to find bridges into that community, because in the end of the day, Zionism is bad also for the Jews in Israel, not just for the Palestinians. Of course, they don't see it now, because Zionism as an ideology gives them privileges, gives them power, gives them a sense of invincibility, but all they have to do is be good students of history. They need to look at what happened to the Crusaders. They need to look what happened to settler colonial projects like the French one in Algeria, and like the white one in South Africa. They also have a window of opportunity that they should exploit. I think it would be very difficult to convince people to give up their privileges, the power, but I think it is also important to work there. All in all, to sum up, I would say the following. The deal of the century and the Trump-Netanyahu vision of a solution for the Palestine issue is an assault on the Palestinian. It's another attempt of destroying Palestine and the Palestinian. That's the aim. The means have changed over the years. The aim has remained the same. To confront this aim, we need to adapt ourselves to the 21st century. First and foremost, as Palestinians and part of the liberation project of Palestine. Secondly, as those who are within the solidarity movements with the Palestinians, and finally, those who live on the ground in Palestine and who are not Palestinians. We don't have the same resources as the coalition has that confronts us, but we have truth on our side. We have the moral justice on our side. The logic of the deal of the century is absurd, does not withstand any moral or factual examination. And yes, it's a fake deal in an age of fake news. The question is, would we have the stamina, the commitment, and the energy to expose the truth, and on that basis liberate Palestine and build there a society and a state for all that would be democratic and would rectify all the past evils by respecting the right of the refugees to return, and by dismantling all the institutions and ideas of settler colonialism that have plagued this country since the arrival of the Zionist movement there in the late 19th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pape. Very enlightening talk. You were able to cover both the past, present, and future concerning the question about actually not a new plan. So I guess calling it Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu plan is not historically accurate, because it is more of a sustained policy that has been structurally wired into the very project that is known as the State of Israel.
Yes.
I have received a number of questions from the viewers. It seems like we had a very positive response from all those listening, and the questions keep coming. So I'm trying to manage reading the questions and also giving them to you at the same time. I'll give you a couple and then let you speak.
That's very good.
And then we'll maybe like you speak for a few minutes, and then I will give you a couple of more questions and group them together in some kind of way that might be coherent. First, I want to visit because we have you here. I want us, and also because we're commemorating the anniversary of the Nakba. I wanted to take us back to 48, and I want for you to school us. I want to take this time for you to school us and educate myself and our listeners on what exactly happened in 48. I mean, what are the different historiographical narratives or perspectives on 48? And how do we, as people who are concerned about justice and social justice in Palestine, how are we supposed to interpret 48? For instance, there are some narratives that say stuff like, Palestinians sold their land before the Jewish settlers arrived. And then there's a lot of things about 48 we don't know. Like, for instance, you detailed in your book Plan D. What was Plan A? What was Plan B? What was Plan C? What is called the Plan Dalit, about the forceful exodus and mass exile of Palestinian people. Could you give us more details about 48 itself? Like, can you walk us through what 48 is and how to think about 48, in an informed manner?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to look at 48 as a moment in history where Zionism as a settler colonial movement had the resources and the opportunity to implement its vision of a de-Arabized Palestine, or as a Jewish Palestine, if not in the whole of the country, at least in most of it. And more focusedly, they needed to wait, first of all, for the end of the British mandate. They could not implement an ethnic cleansing operation while the British were still in power, although there were some mini operations of ethnically cleansing the Palestinian even during the British mandate, but they could not execute a master plan like they did in 48 as long as the British intended to stay in Palestine. So once the British declared that they're going to leave, even before they actually left, and they declared their intention to leave already in February 1947. The moment they declared their intention to leave, the Zionist leadership began, first of all, small operations of occupying Palestinian villages and expelling the people, and intensified these operations towards the very end of the British mandate, and this is where Plan D, which I mentioned, comes into action. On the 10th of March 1948, it was clear that not only the British intend to leave, in fact, they have already left for all intents and purposes. Namely, it was clear that whatever the Zionist forces would do, the British would not interfere. And whereas the expulsions until March the 10th, 1948 were very minimal, from March the 10th, 48, and especially during April, the Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestine moves to a different stage, and they depopulate almost all the Palestinian towns within 3 weeks during April, with a lot of brutality and a lot of force. Now, what they're using as what helps them to do this is that the Palestinian society was a normal pastoral society. It did not prepare itself for a war, neither did it have an army like the Zionist community had. Usually settler communities are much better armed and much better trained and stronger than indigenous people, especially like those in Palestine who believed naively that the international community would respect its obligation for a Palestinian self-determination as it respected it in other Arab countries. So the Palestinians did not have the power to defend themselves. They relied on the Arab world to stop the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but the Arab world, first of all, decided not to interfere until the British left, which is the 15th of May 1948, and by then hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees. And secondly, most of the Arab leaders were not truly committed to defending the Palestinians. Yes, they have sent soldiers into Palestine after the 15th of May, but it was too little and too late to help the Palestinians from being ethnically cleansed. What do we learn from this? I think the most important thing we learn from it is that this ethnic cleansing operation, demolition of half of Palestine's villages, the expulsion of half of Palestine's population, and as I said, the destruction of most of its towns, was done under the eyes of the world. The world had every possibility of stopping it. The Zionist community was not strong could not have withstood a decision by the United Nations or whoever was in charge of the international community at the time to stop it. But the world, especially the Western world, decided to allow the Zionist movement to execute this crime against humanity, because the quid pro quo in their eyes was that especially Europe, and to a certain extent the United States, would not have to deal with the impact of the Holocaust and what its significance was actually for the pretense of the Western civilization to be superior as a culture in comparison to other cultures. And the moment the Zionist movement said, if you allow us to do in Palestine what we want, we would not represent a Jewish allegation against the Western society for the genocide of the Jews during the Second World War. This was the quid pro quo. This is why Israel was the first state to recognize West Germany as a new Germany, before anyone else did it. We need to learn from this that the international community stood on the side when that crime was committed, and continue to stand on the side when, as I mentioned in my talk, the ethnic cleansing continue in other means after 1948. I think it's very important to look at 48, at the Nakba, as the Arabs, as we call it in Arabic, al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba. It's very important to understand that we are still in the same historical chapter. This chapter is not over, for good and for worse. And the deal of the century is just another chapter in the attempt to complete the Nakba. It's not a new chapter. It's a different means of achieving what was not fully achieved in 1948. I'm stopping here because I want to answer also other people's...
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, you know, we've heard a lot from prominent scholars on either issues like the Nakba or settler colonialism in general. Well, I remember being very surprised by Michael Walzer's arguments in his book Just and Unjust Wars, where he talks about Alsace-Lorraine. And he says that an occupying community over time, I mean, it's a kind of Lockean position, but as you begin to create some kind of social good out of this occupation, then the historical crime that was committed in blood and tears slowly begins to evaporate. I think there's somewhat of this Walzerian mood today in Israel, and also from the international community. How do we think about the Nakba in terms of the kinds of arguments made by Michael Walzer?
Yeah. Yes. You know, maybe, I'm saying very maybe, if the Nakba was one singular event, let's say there was this ethnic cleansing operation, and for some reason afterwards you would have a Jewish community that does not continue, or a state that does not continue the ethnic cleansing, and even feels a bit like Germany after the Holocaust, that it needs to make amends for a crime it committed and looks for ways of reconciliation and so on. Maybe there will be some sort of a basis for this Walzerian attitude. But what happened is exactly the opposite. Ethnic cleansing became part of the DNA of the Jewish state. Mm-hmm. Because of the international legitimacy given to such actions. So in fact, what happened is exactly the opposite of what Walzer says. Because we got away with the crime in 1948, we can get away with our attempts to complete it after 1948. In other words, you cannot beautify the ideology. You cannot be a liberal colonialist. You cannot be an enlightened ethnic cleanser, and you cannot be a reformist Zionist, which is what Walzer is trying to do. Can I
ask you something?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
I mean, we sometimes, I mean, I grew up in the States, so I got a good public school education, you know. Mm-hmm. And Israel and Palestine was taught to me, you know, in a sense that there was, you know, it was a transitional moment. There was a birth of a nation, and as all nations are born, there's a chaos and there's violence, and unfortunately some bad things happened, and people lost their land, but you know, oh well, you know, something great happened, which was a new nation was born. I mean, this was the kind of way that it was presented to us. Yes. So my question is specifically, like, how do we think about these kinds of narratives? You know, where the birth of a nation is just coded with violence, that we unimaginable violence. We can't really comprehend it. We can't really think about it. Meaning, how can we get into the nitty gritty? What actually happened? Like, where can students of Palestine go in and say, look at these documents, look at these issues? I mean, I know that it's very specific, but something to take home, I mean, for us to study further.
Well, it's quite simple in many ways because in a way I think the term Nakba contributed unfortunately to this kind of narrative, because Nakba talks about a catastrophe. It doesn't talk about the crime. You know, who knows who's behind the catastrophe? There's no one to be blamed. It's unfortunate, but what happened? Ethnic cleansing, on the other hand, like genocide, is a very clear definition of a crime. And where there is a crime, there are criminals and there are victims. So it's not just a matter of getting to the nitty-gritty. It's a matter of asking yourself, and that's what you should take with it from this, I think. Is 1948 an accident of nature, a chaotic moment in history, or is it an implementation of an ideology and strategy that is very easy for us as historians to find its origins in the writings of Zionist ideologues, leaders? We can point to the ethnic cleansing, the incremental ethnic cleansing that occurred before 1948, and the documentation I have given in my book, The Ethnic Cleansing, shows a clear systematic planning by a few number of leaders and generals in the community, in the Zionist community in Palestine, who detailed, and eventually it comes into full exposure in Plan D, who detail the expulsion and destruction and displacement and replacement of Palestinians wherever they are in historical Palestine. This is where the narrative should be confronted. The narrative that things happen, or as my colleague Benny Morris says, you know, there was a war and this is a result of the war. No, the paradigm is different. The war was the means for the ethnic cleansing. The ethnic cleansing is not the result of the war. The ethnic cleansing is not the result of the war. The war was part of the ethnic cleansing. It was the means of getting to the ethnic cleansing. I think it's very, you know who doesn't need such a proof? Palestinians who live on the ground today. They understand exactly, even if they haven't read anything about settler colonialism, even if they haven't read anything about ethnic cleansing, they experience daily what does it mean when someone covets your land and someone wants to replace you with their own. It can be done on a very minimal space, and it can be done as a master plan for the whole space, but it's very easy to show that 750,000 people, and later 1 million, in 49, did not become refugees because of a chaos. They did not become refugees because they wanted to become refugees. The only reason people who lived for more than 1,000 of years on the land become refugees is because someone expelled them and did not allow them to return. So this is not just the nitty-gritty. It is how to explain the fact that for centuries, whoever occupied Palestine did not create a refugee problem. How is it possible? The Egyptians occupied, during Muhammad Ali's period, they occupied Palestine. The Crusaders occupied Palestine. The British occupied. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon.
Actually, I'm going to articulate a question that relates to this, so then we can. I'm actually losing control of the questions. There's so much response coming from your talk that
Sorry about that.
I need to stop trying to group this together. I'm going to start going a rapid round. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple of questions. I'm just going to read them as I found them, and then you can respond. Okay. Number one,
very good.
Why does colonialism and occupation in the modern period take such a genocidal mode, while the land of Palestine has been occupied before? So what is the logics of modernity that create it to be such a genocidal project, settler colonialism, not just in Palestine but elsewhere?
Okay.
Second question. Can you walk us through 1948 and the responses of the Muslim world, and why Muslim-majority countries were unable to prevent what happened? I think you touched on it a little bit in your talk when you said the leadership at that time was not very enthusiastic. Number three, now with the citizenship law of 2018 and the self-declaration of Israel, obviously as a religious nationalist project, What is your prediction about the future of religious nationalisms writ large? I mean, not just in Israel.
The future of
religious nationalism.
Religious nationalism. Okay.
Number 4, and then we'll stop and I'll let you respond. What do you think the weaknesses or pressure points that Israeli body politic or Israeli society at large would make them give up the idea of a greater Israel compromise? Or is it a zero-sum game?
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Thank you for all the excellent question. Let me start with the first question. Actually, I don't think it's a modern notion to be so genocidal in terms of colonialist project. It's in fact, as the late scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, said, when settlers who came from Europe encountered indigenous population, their actions were informed by a logic that he calls the elimination of the native. And in North America, the elimination of the native meant genocide, as it did in Australia. In other parts, it meant apartheid, like in South Africa, and more so as ethnic cleansing in the case of Palestine. So I think that the idea of eliminating the native, whether by expelling the indigenous population or by, unfortunately, genociding it, is an old idea. What changes are the means. What modernity brings to the fore is lethal weapons that can do the job can commit the crime against humanity quicker and in a more brutal way. And I think that this is where modernity comes to it. There's another level. Modernity provides better means of manipulation of the truth, and you can try and describe ethnic cleansing as national security. You can describe assassination as killing a terrorist, and so on, and I'm sure the viewers are familiar with that. About the Muslim and Arab world's reaction in 48, we have to remember most of the Muslim world and most of the Arab world was still colonized in 1948. They had their own struggles for liberation to deal with, and that is one reason it was limited in their capacity to help, which is not an excuse today. Secondly, among the neighboring countries of Palestine, 3 very important countries, Egypt, Jordan, at that time was called Transjordan, and Iraq, were very much under the grip of Britain. Britain was very dominant in their politics and could direct it in a way that did not endanger the Zionist project in Palestine. This is why you can see a much more assertive action on the side of Syria, which is not under British control and is already an independent Arab nation state. They are far more assertive in their attempt to help the Palestinians. National religious or religious nationalism, as the person who asked it put it. I suppose we're talking about political Islamic group and so on. I think, like everyone else, also people who are part of the Islamic movement inside Israel or part of the Hamas or jihad, I'm talking about within the Palestinian context, would also have to adapt themselves to the 21st centuries to see how their vision of the future and their idea of how to get there are tally with the realities on the ground. I must tell you that I'm part of an initiative on the ground called the One Democratic State campaign, which includes people who are members of the Islamic movement, and even members who are people who are members of the Communist Party. But this is the younger generation, and it's far easier to begin there a dialogue of consensus. It's a whole lecture, which I won't give it to you now. For instance, how to navigate between misunderstanding of the idea of secularism as a vision from one point, and the idea of a Dawla Madaniya, the civic state that the Muslim Brotherhood have put forward in Egypt. Very interesting things are happening on the ground in this respect. Nobody is immune from a retrospective analysis of their vision, strategies, and policies. And last, what was this? I don't understand my own writing. What did I write here? Do you remember the last question?
The last question, I don't remember. 1 second. I think that was it. I think we covered.
No, I think there was another one, but I just can't.
Oh, the pressure points.
The pressure points. That's the word I was looking for. Pressure point. Yeah. Well, I think that in order to find the pressure points, you have to understand that this whole project of Israel is standing on two pillars. One is the moral pillar, and one is the material pillar. The moral pillar has been totally eroded, and it's beginning to have an impact on the younger generation. A larger number of young people who refuse to go to the army, a larger number of young people leaving the country, not wanting to be part of it. Materially, they're doing well, so you don't hit them. I think the BDS, in a way, has their a formula which understands these two pillars in order to trigger a change from within. But really, I think that the pressure points would be best understood, or we will expose them much better if we had a clear Palestinian vision for the future. It would be much easier to recruit people and to understand it, because Israel is at the junction now. It was there before, but I think finally the world understands it. You can either be an apartheid racist state or a democratic, non-Zionist, non-Jewish state. The whole idea that you can be both, or you can be a democratic Jewish state, all this has blown into the air. That doesn't exist anymore. So, what is the movement to the other junction? What is the opposite of the apartheid state? I don't expect Israelis to say this. Palestinians have to say, what is the alternative to the apartheid state of Israel? We need a clear Palestinian answer to that question, and then we can see pressure points and so on. I think it's very confusing now to see it beyond what the BDS is doing, which is very good.
Okay, so I'm gonna again hit you with some.
That's okay.
The questions have is like I said, they're flooding in. So does the shifting geopolitical scene, the rise of China, assertive Russia, muscular India, change any calculations for the future of Israel, for the future of Palestine? Number two, assuming Israel annexes large parts of the West Bank in the near future, what actual changes on the ground would take place? Number three, this is kind of related to our earlier question about Muslim leaders. Israel understands no language other than the language of force. They have not only succeeded in occupying the whole of Palestine, but they also managed to gain the upper hand in appointing leaders in the Arab world that cater to their needs and interests at the expense of the people in these countries. Do you truly see political dialogue as an agent of change? And I'll say one more, and then we'll stop. Looking into the distant future, if the Israeli state is as isolated as the apartheid regime in South Africa was, how do you think Israeli political elite would react? Also, from experience, under what conditions does Israel decide on waging wars or using mass violence? I think those are two very different questions. I thought they would be the same.
Yeah. Okay. China and India. As I said in my lecture, even there, the kind of idea of official position and a basic civil society position is relevant. Of course, China is very different from India in this respect. But I think that looking at the official policies of these two countries, I don't think that for the time being, unless it's going to change, they are bringing something that can change the reality on the ground. I say it very unfortunately. India is an interesting case because I think that you can see it in the embassy in Tel Aviv, where whoever was the ambassador there really usually do speak a language that is more attractive to our ears in terms of Palestinian rights and so on. But the person who's really important in that embassy is the military attaché and not the ambassador. And this has a lot to do with the strategic military connection between the two countries. But I've toured India several times, and I know that there are large sections of the society, not only among the Muslim community, but also in the Hindu community, who remember Gandhi and Nehru and their legacy, the days of the 50s and the 60s, where China stood alongside the Palestinian revolution and helped it in any way possible. What is the meaning of annexation on the ground? We have already, we don't have to guess here. When Israel annexed officially parts of the Golan Heights, and when it annexed officially parts of Greater Jerusalem, it expelled the population. Areas which are officially under Israeli control are officially under Israeli control and and were occupied after 67. Was two things I want to say about dialogue. One is dialogue can be very tough. BDS for me is a dialogue. BDS it's a dialogue with the Israelis, saying to them, as long as you continue with your policies, you will be a pariah state. I'm talking to them. I'm not coupled with understanding not through the logic of things, but because of the power of things, that the coalition you based your power on has crumbled, and there's a new reality on the ground. Is this an excuse for a war on Israel's side? Maybe, I don't know. I think the Israelis see war as an ordinary means in their arsenal for achieving political means. We all have to think about the concept of war in 21st century. It has changed a bit. What Israel does, Israel likes to call its assaults in Gaza a war. It's more than a war. It's a punitive action of a settler colonialist movement against indigenous. Beyond that, but that doesn't huge military operations in order to further its means, to implement its strategy. But believe me, from a Palestinian point of view, what Israel is doing is brutal, inhuman, and bad every minute of their life, regardless of whether we call it war, oppression, occupation, whatever it is. And I think our main task is to stop that. And this has to be stopped sooner than later.
As we head into the last couple of minutes, I will give the last set of questions, Dr. Pape, and thanks for your patience and your insight. This set of questions has to do with the U.S. So you mentioned in your talk that both the Zionist project and the Arab leadership had to wait until the British left in order to actually fulfill whatever was their desires or lack of action in the case of Arab leaders. How come the British presence in Palestine stalled what was a genocidal ethnic cleansing project, yet under the sponsorship of the U.S., it seems like there is no desire to even create an idea, like a atmosphere of liberal, sensibilities. I mean, it's just kind of like it's a complete blank check. So the question is, what do you think Israel could ever be crossed off of U.S.'s objective interests in the Middle East? Why do you think the U.S. Looks the other way on Israeli government's crimes against fellow human beings? And do you think that the steal of the century would ever be possible if Trump was not president? Or is this dependent on specifically Trump's election to office?
Yeah, definitely. Let me refer to the first question. Just a note on the British position. I think that what was behind the British indifference in a way and allowing what happened to happen was the idea that Britain has to withdraw from many of its possessions. They were looking only at the interests of the British soldiers and the British civilians who were there in Palestine, with totally disregard to the place that they have colonized for 30 years. It happened in many other places. They left mayhem behind them without any scruple or kind of moral judgment. In the case of Palestine, it was worse because the whole Zionist project started there with in 1917 in many ways, when they gave something that did not belong to them to someone it did not belong to. And I think that's where we would have expected them then, or at least now, to take a different position. But the main question was about the American position about it. Now, in order to, I don't take a determinist view on an American policy. I don't think it will always be like that. I don't think it was always like that, by the way. I think people forget that although in the 50s and the 60s of the last century, the United States policy towards the Arab world was nothing to write home about. It was motivated by the Cold War issues and so on, and rejected some of the more progressive and radical Arab regimes. On the question of Palestine, it actually was quite sound. The Americans supported the right of return. Don't know if many of the viewers know it, but America imposed sanctions on Israel because it refused to allow the refugees to return. President Kennedy, we know now from the documents, was about to do the same before he was assassinated, to bring back the issue of Palestinian refugees and force Israel to accept the refugees. I don't know if that is why he was assassinated or not, but definitely the Israelis were very relieved to see him go, because he was about to bring back the Palestine issue. So we shouldn't take a kind of determinist view on it, but we should remember, and I will be very brief here, that American policy is based on kind of three legs. One leg is the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, which is not getting stronger. It's getting weaker as the years go by. We have to remember that. It's a weakness point for the Israeli policy in the United States. The other leg is the Christian Zionist lobby, which unfortunately gets stronger and not weaker. So the Israelis rely much more on Christian Zionists than they rely on pro-Israeli Zionist community. So we need to think, what do we do with that? Not just for the sake of Palestine. I think a lot of Americans would like to think what to do with this racist, white supremacist ideology, because so many Americans are not white in the American racist definitions. And the third stool is the military-industrial complex, which sees Israel, of course, as an asset and a laboratory for experimenting with new weapons at the expense of the Palestinians. So whoever in the United States and outside the United States is abhorred by these moral positions, either by these lobbies or by these industrial military complexes and their policies, not just in Israel, but everywhere else in the world where American weapons are used for oppressive measures. I think we need to create this web, this solidarity of identification I was talking about, in order to tap into the many Americans who oppose these policies, but has never been effective enough of changing the policies from above. But never take it as a given that American policy will always be like this. Now, finally, would have been the deal of the century? Would the deal happened if, let's say, Mrs. Clinton would have been the president? Well, from a Palestinian point of view, or from the point of view of someone like me who supports with all his heart the Palestinian cause, to say that I would have been elated to know that Hillary Clinton would be the next president of the United States would be a gross exaggeration. And I think in many ways the difference between Trump and Biden is the difference between the Likud in Israel and what used to be and has already vanished liberal Zionists. It is the difference between declaring openly what you do, and then it makes it a bit easier for you to confront it because you know what you're facing, and trying to hide what you do for whatever reason, maybe because you're ashamed, or maybe because you know back in your mind that this is not the right thing to do, or you want to be also accepted by more conscientious people. Whatever the reason is, we will not have the deal of the century as a coherent document, but we would have had the deal of the century as a policy on the ground, and we would have the same challenges as we do face today.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to try to get in some last questions because there's so many questions that came. I don't want to be unfair to some of the people that were listening patiently. How should people, including Muslims, deconstruct the power of the Zionist movement for human rights without being accused of being anti-Jews or anti-Semitic? That's number one. Mm-hmm. Number two is, do you think a young millennial, centrist, left-wing Jewish generation would be able to start seeing the atrocities of Israel's Zionism or settler colonialist movement and somehow dismantle the theocratic politics within Israel, similar to what happened in South Africa decades after decades of systematic apartheid politics? And lastly, why do you think Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, or other Muslim-majority countries seem to be passively supportive of the Trump-Netanyahu's steal of the century deal? And that is all of the questions.
Good. Yeah. As we know, Israel and its supporters have weaponized anti-Semitism as means of stifling debate on Palestine, silencing criticism on Israel. And it's a good question. How do we deal with it? Not just as Muslims, as anyone who would support Israel would be accused of anti-Semitism, or in the case of Jews, of being self-hating Jews. So we all face the same kind of accusation. The problem when we deal with it is to remember, and that's the best advice I can give, is that you cannot deal with it with a soundbite. Someone says you are anti-Semitic if you do that and that, you're going to say I'm not, and hope that this would work. You need to insist on a space and a place to explain exactly what is Judaism, what is Zionism, and therefore what is anti-Semitism and what is anti-Zionism. It doesn't take more than 10 to 15 minutes, but usually the mainstream media would not give you that space, and the people who accuse you don't want to hear, of course, a counter argument. But you have to explain it to yourself, and once you are convinced yourself, this kind of weapon would not be working. There are so many means today in the alternative media to do this, and so we have to go on this campaign of explaining. And as I say, it doesn't take too long, but you can't do it in 1 minute. And people have to be patient and listen to the history of Zionism, how it evolved out of Judaism, what do Jews think about Zionism, and how does Zionism fit within settler colonialism in general. And there you can kind of deconstruct and show the absurdity of this kind of allegation. But you need the time to do this. As for a new generation of Jews, millennials, both in the United States and Israel, let me say, in the United States, I'm more hopeful. I already can see the signs. Yes, they know too much not to be moved by what they know, and some of them even have seen, even when Israel brought them under a program called Discovery that was meant to convince them to immigrate, what they saw was enough actually to make them activists on the campuses with solidarity with the Palestinians instead. So I think, yes, there's a great hope in that generation. I'm less optimistic about the similar generation here in Israel, but I think there is a change. There is a small subculture of young Jews here who are more critical than their predecessors were, who do not go to the army, who work in solidarity with the occupied Palestinians wherever they can. It's a very small group. I don't want to exaggerate, but it's growing. It is growing, and I hope one day that it would be a significant actor in changing the reality on the ground. Finally, the regimes in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and some others believe that Israel is the key to American support. That if you satisfy Israel, you satisfy the United States, and if you satisfy the United States, you get support either against opposition from within or against rivals which are genuine or imaginative, such as Iran. I think that's the main motive behind it, but I think there's something deeper there. Palestine, as in other places in the world, is this issue of moral justice. And it's just, it's not just about Palestine, it's about any injustice. And once you open this box of injustice on one case, other boxes of injustice might pry open. And you don't want that, as if you are a regime that is not particularly strong in fighting injustice or abuse of power. And I think that was always the strength and the weakness of the Palestinian issue in the Arab world. It was a strength because it tapped with so many other things which were wrong in the Arab world. But because of that, it was seen by regimes as an issue that you have to pay lip service to, but not really act upon, because if you act upon it, it can bring revolutions in your own countries. So I think there's a hope there that you can, especially Saudi Arabia is a brilliant case in this. How far can you go without having full diplomatic relationship with Israel and satisfy everyone? Well, history, if I can ever give a history tutorial to Salman to MBS, I would say to him that history tells us that people who want to satisfy all three different contradictory masters end up of dissatisfying them all. And this could be very disastrous in the end. But for the time being, I agree, this is a problem which is one of the many challenges we face in order to bring justice, peace, and freedom to Palestine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pape. That was an extensive and I'm sure a bit exhausting engagement. Thank you very much. As always, I haven't seen, to be honest with you, so much response from the participants for the other seminars as much as I saw for this. We had a number of very interesting questions. Next week, I want to let the viewers know that we will have Dr. Samuel Arian speaking about ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and geopolitical analysis. I'd like to thank our staff for putting this on, and I'd like to thank especially Dr. Pape for his time, and I'd like to thank the viewers and for their participation. I look forward to hosting you guys again next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Ramadan Kareem, and see you soon.